there's many sides to a story, and the ones that we're holding on to are just one side. And for every traumatic moment seen a different way, there's probably a beautiful moment in the exact same moment. It's just how you experience it. We know from brain science that you tell yourself the same thing, I think it's 7 or 8 times, you start to actually believe it. So even if you say time is linear and what we understand to be the physical world is immutable, recasting those stories and telling yourself that new story multiple times actually changes the brain patterns.
Welcome to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. My name is Keith Fiveson. We are an official podcast for the Psychedelic Science Convention 2023 in June. That'll be June 19th through the 23rd in Denver. I really hope you can make it. Find out more information about it at psychedelicscience.org. On this podcast, I had the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Ronan Levy. He is a true visionary in the field of mental health and consciousness. Ronan is a man who has dedicated his life to unlocking the potential of psychedelic and cannabis therapies for the betterment of humanity. He is a co-founder of Field Trip Health. He has pioneered what is now rapidly a growing movement towards the use of psychedelics for the treatment of mental illness and addiction. But there's a lot more to the story. When you hear the podcast, I think your mind will explode. Ronan's passion really has extended itself and continues as he has a media production company called the Non-Ordinary Company. I love that name. He has strived to inspire and educate millions of people worldwide to explore these substances and their therapeutic use with an upcoming documentary. It's a full-length documentary called Everybody is Doing Drugs. So it really promises to be a game changer in the conversation around mental health and drug use. He also has a podcast called the Non-Ordinary Podcast. He's talking about changing the name, but it's a real must-listen for anyone who is interested in the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and consciousness. As well, I think the guy bends time, but as well, he has 2 books, The Trip Journal and The Ketamine Breakthrough, which have further established him as a leading voice in the emerging field. His expertise in psychedelic therapy has led him to be a part of a very exciting workshop that will be at the Psychedelic Science Convention. It includes his insights from his work with psychodrama. So you'll be very interested to hear more about that. So Ronan is a disruptive force of nature, driven by a deep desire to shift the narrative around these mental health and substance use conversations. His work is grounded in years of research and experience, and he knows firsthand, he's experienced this firsthand, the healing power and the potential of these treatments. His vision is of a future where cannabis and psychedelics are mainstream treatments for mental illness as an exciting and inspiring possibility. So we're honored to welcome Ronan Levy to the Mindfulness Experience for this special episode in partnership with the Psychedelic Science Convention. Please join us welcoming Mr. Ronan Levy. Good afternoon. This is Keith Fiveson at the Mindfulness Experience podcast, and we've got today a special guest, Ronan Levy, or Levy. My apologies, and because we talked about that before, right? I mean, it's a good name. I like the bread. I like the name. I like the tribe. I'm a part of the tribe, so why not go with it, right?
Fair enough. The truth is most people pronounce Levy. You got Eugene Levy. You got all the big people with the same spelled last name out there, and they pronounce it Levy. We're kind of the abstraction from the rule when it comes to how we pronounce our last name, and I have no idea why, to be quite honest.
Well, me bad. I do apologize for that. But we did your intro, and you are really a pioneer in the cannabis and the psychedelic industry. And I just want to chop into it because in reading your bio, one of the questions I have is, have you figured out how to expand or bend time and space to be able to do all the things you do?
No, I don't think so. It's one of those things. Someone recently referred to me as hyper productive, and I don't feel that way. I think more than having an innate skill set to be super productive, I've been very fortunate to surround myself with people who are really good at getting stuff done. And that enables me to come up with random, sometimes very often harebrained ideas, and then see them come to life magically because there's good people around me. But I'm not that competent at most things. I think maybe either I'm really good at spitting a good story that people can get behind, or I'm incredibly fortunate that I happen to meet the right people who can get a lot of things done and help bring things to life.
Yeah. Well, that's very modest of you. I really do believe that you are the one. You maybe Neo, because you've figured out how to bend the spoon with, and I think there is that quality. You've inspired millions of people. You really were the co-founder for Field Trip Health, and you continue to do work. You've got this Non-Ordinary Company. You've released your first full-length documentary, which you're getting in the preparation for. I went to the website, I signed up.
Excellent.
It's amazing stuff. Plus, you've got this book, and you're really going to be at the convention, at the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention, and you've got a really interesting program there that I really want to chop into or break down or look at a little bit more. I hate that word chop, but I want to break that down and unpack it a little bit more. You'll be speaking on psychodrama and ketamine-assisted therapy, psychotherapy, and there's a workshop that you're going to be doing, and it's a novel approach to treatment and in the psychotherapy area. But as I told you before we started, I've done a program in psychodrama, and I've also done core energetics and the whole aspect of really moving energy, in the body that could be stagnant through narratives. And I want to understand, what is this workshop going to be about? What's your perspective about this, and how do we unpack that a little bit more? There's a lot there.
Sure. So maybe I was being modest before, but I'm certainly not being modest here when we talk about this workshop. I was not the brainchild of the workshop. I was fortunate enough to have great partners in the Non-Ordinary Company who helped bring this together. And it was the brainchild of a New York-based psychiatrist and psychotherapist, Dr. Geeta Vaid, who's very interested in exploration and experimentation. When we talk about psychedelic assisted therapies, most of us by and large are still following what was kind of developed in the 60s. Certainly leveraging some indigenous insights as well. There's no doubt about that, but the protocol has been pretty standard for the last 50 or 60 years, and probably rightfully so when you think about the political climate and all that kind of stuff. But there's no reason that we shouldn't be innovating. And so one of Geeta's focuses is, what can we do to enhance opportunities? And so she had reached out to Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps the Score, and said, Bessel, if we were going to pair ketamine with any given psychotherapeutic technique, what would you recommend? And if anyone who has read The Body Keeps the Score knows, he goes through a number of different techniques. And he said, without doubt, psychodrama. And so because we were close with Geeta, she's like, why don't we document this? This is cutting edge stuff. It can be used for educational purposes. It could potentially be turned into a documentary on its own. Lots of cool stuff just to capture this experience for something that, as far as we know, has never been done before. And so we all got together in Hudson, New York. Bessel and Alicia Skye, his partner, led us through the few days of ketamine with psychodrama. And sometimes that meant doing ketamine before the psychodrama session. Sometimes it meant doing ketamine after. Sometimes it meant doing ketamine during, just to see what would happen. And I just love that willingness to experiment. I mean, we are talking about people's minds and psyches, and so you have to be pretty brave and confident to walk into those situations to know. And the experience was beautiful. It really was quite transformative.
Now, not everyone knows what psychodrama is, so I think it's really important to unpack that a little bit more. Can you give us some perspective in terms of, the protagonist and so on and so forth? But what is psychodrama, and how does it apply in terms of helping people to untangle that web that they weave over, in terms of their life story or where they're at that particular point?
Sure. And this was my only experience with psychodrama. So please feel free to offer different perspectives or correct or clarify, because I'm just sharing the knowledge from this one experience. But what it is there's a person who gets selected as the protagonist. And he's a person, or she's a person, who sits in the middle of the group. This is a group experience. And there's someone called the witness. And the witness tends to be someone who has a lot of experience managing the psychodrama. And either the protagonist has something specifically they want to work on, or they can just strike up a conversation about things that are coming up. And then the witness will kind of hone in and pick on or a thread of something that seems acute or is worth expanding on. And as you expand on that and the witness is asking questions, what inevitably happens is you realize the crux of that thread comes from experiences that we've lived through. And so those experiences are baked into our psyches, they're baked into our brains, they're baked into our minds, but we get a chance to relive them, and we can re-experience them. So the person who's the protagonist, it may turn out that one of the underlying currents is something that happened with his or her mother as a child. And then they get to select a person from the group who enrolls as that person's mother and steps into the circle and plays the role of that person's mother. And then there's a communication back and forth. So you may go back to that particular moment that was traumatic. And now as the protagonist, as an adult, you can say like, hey, when you did that, that really fucked me up, right? And have an opportunity to re-experience that moment. And then what becomes really cool is, we'll just use the mother example, continuing on. Obviously, what happened in that moment, your mother wasn't there for you in some capacity, to say it shortly.
It's my story.
Me as my dad. Then you can enroll someone who plays the role of your ideal mother. And then the witness will help the ideal mother say the things that your real mother should have said in that moment that you needed to hear. And it's a way to reprocess that experience. But what's particularly interesting about psychodrama, at least according to Bessel, is that it plays to both sides of the mind, right? Because you go into talk therapy, you can have a psychedelic experience, and you're processing it on an emotional, logical level, right? But when you put a person in the room and you're talking to a real person and they have 3 dimensions, it engages a different part of the brain. And so you now have the integration of both hemispheres of the brain playing through this experience, which rewrites it much more effectively than just having like a talk therapy or talking through a screen or something along those lines. That was my experience of psychodrama, but I do invite you to clarify, correct, or expand on anything that I shared.
No, Ronan, that's beautiful. And I've always said that, you change your story, you change your life. And, totally. And if you, and certainly the medicine helps you to reboot. But there's always been, I say reboot, reset, reframe, but there's always been that element of reset and reframe. Yep. So I think what you're really talking about here is having the emotional literacy so that you can go back, you can reboot, reset through the emotional literacy now that we didn't have when we were kids, right? Mommy and daddy left the room and went to the bathroom or went to the kitchen and we streamed, whatever the case, right? Yep. So, so I really like the way this is applying, and the fact that we're taking now the medicine and the opportunity to let go of the default mode network and then go a little bit deeper. I want to ask you, how does it differ from, in your view, from the way it's being done now in traditional talk therapy, perhaps, or how might it be more effective with certain individuals?
Yeah, from my perspective, I think one of
Mm-hmm.
the limitations with traditional talk therapy is you can be overly cerebral. And it was actually really interesting watching some of the participants in this psychodrama, even with
Mm-hmm.
ketamine, that people who had done a lot of therapy immediately went to intellectualizing what they were talking about. Instead of actually getting angry, they're explaining why they should get angry, and that doesn't work. And it does seem that in order to reboot, reset, and reframe, I think were the three words.
Right.
You need to feel the emotions. There's that old cliche, you got to feel it to heal it. And it
Right.
really was one of those things. And I think what was special about pairing the ketamine experience with this is, just like any psychedelic experience, your ego is down. The ability to have the ego compress the emotional component was reduced. So even if some people started down the path of over intellectualizing what they were feeling, it was a lot easier to punch through to the emotional level, where I think the real magic happens in all of these experiences. And I think that was really unique and really powerful, because defenses were down. They had to be down. And, it was the skill of Bessel and Leisha and all that kind of stuff to make sure that the psychodrama played out as hoped, as intended. But you could also see that when one person initially was intellectualizing it, after the ketamine experience and whenever that occurred, their ability to do so changed. And we saw people change almost magically through these experiences.
It's really wonderful, because here you are in the group, sort of a fishbowl, or, the opportunity to be seen, to be heard, to be witnessed, to be recognized. And I think that's the medicine itself, to be able to go ahead and somehow articulate, what your story is, but all of those defense mechanisms get in the way. And then to be able to go ahead and reboot, reset, reframe, to be able to use someone and say the words that you didn't say, to be able to get, just change the situation, even though it's now, what was then is now, and then you're able to look at it differently. Yeah.
100%. You mentioned it, and it's actually, you touched on our documentary. It's like the outcome of the documentary is everybody has a story to wake up from. And one of the powerful realizations I had, because the documentary essentially follows me through a whole bunch of different psychedelic experiences, was that there's many sides to a story, and the ones that we're holding on to are just one side. And for every traumatic moment seen a different way, there's probably a beautiful moment in the exact same moment. It's just how you experience it, and rewriting that. It's not only emotionally cathartic. We know from brain science that you tell yourself the same thing, I think it's 7 or 8 times, you start to actually believe it. So even, I mean, we can go deep into the metaphysical conversations about whether time is real or not, but even if you say time is linear and what we understand to be the physical world is immutable, recasting those stories and telling yourself that new story multiple times actually changes the brain patterns, changes the neurology of it. So it's scientifically backed as well as spiritually, emotionally backed experiences. And that's what really, I think, makes it so powerful. The other thing I wanted to touch on too was, in psychodrama, being seen, being witnessed is such a powerful part. It validates all the emotions you felt in that moment when you felt invalidated as a child or whenever. But what happens, I think, when you have the medicine is you receive the experience of being witnessed more, because even in the psychodrama you're witnessed, if your defenses are up to some degree, it's not going to land. But when your defenses are down coming out of a ketamine experience, that feeling of being witnessed, I think, just strikes much more deeply. And that was certainly an experience I had, not during the psychodrama, but after a San Pedro experience in Costa Rica when making the documentary. It's like everybody's emotions, everyone's guard was down. And to be witnessed in that moment when your guard is down and their guard is down is probably the most potent experience that any person can have in this life to change, those hurts, those traumas, all those things we hold on to.
That's a beautiful thing. I truly believe that we all just want to be seen, heard, recognized, have the basics, food, shelter, clothing. And if we're aspirational in some way, to be loved and to love someone else. I mean, that's really, the cash and the prizes are just, that's just a way of survival. right? I mean, the other stuff is a way of really living life and really interconnecting with other people. So it's beautiful. Yeah.
It's a really interesting conversation for right now, because I believe we're on the cusp of a post-scarcity world, right? And in a scarcity-based existence, which has defined most of human existence for however long we've been around, power and money were the drivers. And there was reason to have those drivers, because those ensured survival in a scarce world. In a post-scarcity world, when everyone has their needs fulfilled, food, clothing, shelter, and there's no uncertainty around it, all of a sudden power and money become a lot less relevant, right? It's just like, so you don't need that anymore. It's not as intrinsic as a drive. And that leaves us in a situation being like, okay, well, if power and money aren't the drivers, what the hell is going to be the driver? Like, is the pursuit of love and connection enough to keep us motivated, fulfilled, happy? I don't know. It's a really interesting question, and it's one of the things that I'm very interested in exploring right now. And that's actually, I have a podcast right now called the Non-Ordinary Podcast, but I'm thinking about changing the title to How We Evolve. And it's really about exploring that question, which is how do we evolve? You know, I just came from a conference called the Intelligent Change Summit, hosted by Alex and Mimi Icon, and the attendees were some of the most successful people you could possibly imagine. And all of them were there looking to change. Like, somehow all of that success that we value in our society wasn't enough. And when you wake up from that consideration, when you wake up from the, oh yeah, money and power and all the things I was pursuing aren't actually that fulfilling, man. It's a really interesting and challenging and vexing question. And so I want to dive deep into that, being like, okay, so what is enough? How do we find that fulfillment and meaning? You know, we can look to ancient philosophies on some levels, and I certainly think there's a lot of knowledge there, but my sense is we're not going to find the answers in the past. We've got to find them somewhere in the future. And it's going to be, I think, a very fun exploration.
Well, I certainly, as a mindfulness guy, I mean, I'm all about presencing. So, you know, I mean, if we're present to the present, then there is no past, there is no future, there's only what is now. And within that space, if you have food, shelter, clothing, and you have enough, then there really is interconnection, and the interconnection with other people, the environment, relationships, yourself, you know, your own sense of interconnection with the universe, right? Isn't that beautiful?
Absolutely. The spiritual teacher I work with, a guy named Erwin Perlman, based out of LA, was actually featured. We just, one of the books that I co-authored just came out through Hay House, and Hay House was kind enough to put on a Psychedelic Summit. So anyone interested in hearing a whole bunch of smart people speak about psychedelics, please check out the Hay House Summit, Psychedelic Summit. But Erwin was featured on it. He talks about how the process of evolution up to this point has been about individuation and separation. Right? We're now individuals. I'm Ronan, you're Keith, and we're separate. But now the evolution that we're on the cusp of is how we go from individuated and separate to individuated and connected. You know, a process or a term he calls enchantment. And that's exactly it.
Right.
And it's a very interesting exploration, but I really like the term enchantment. It's got a lot of beautiful energy around it.
Yeah, it does. And, you know, I think in relationship, when we look at our interdependence with each other, on each other, you know, that we can't, no man is an island. I mean, it's a very, you know, for some people that would be a very kind of Eastern Buddhist view, but I mean, it's the way life is, right? So yeah, I feel like we could spend this time really diving deep into the existential angst of it all, and you know, and that would lead us to death. So then we'd have a whole other conversation after that.
You know, it's funny though, because like there's so much talk about mental health, the mental health crisis, and all that kind of stuff, and I don't know, I just get this real instinctive sense that like talking about it as mental health is just trying to put a band-aid on it. It's like these are the existential questions that are leading to the mental health crisis. So unless you're dealing with the existential questions, you're never going to solve the mental health crisis. Like they're two interdependent conversations, and that's why I love nerding out on the existential questions, because
yeah,
that's where
It's good. I mean, Gabor Mate talks about the fact that we're all born into a trauma-ridden society, and we know that, and it's we're trying to normalize the trauma in this craziness, and at the same point, people are having a dis-ease that is coming up not only mentally, psychologically, emotionally, and they're trying to cope. And that's where addiction comes in. That's where misuse comes in. That's where, like, I'm not meant for this world, So and that's also where the medicine comes in and where the work comes in. Now, I want to get to your work, which is, can you tell me a little bit more about Field Trip? Because that's, we can't have this podcast without talking about Field Trip, right? And it really is the intersection of your involvement in the cannabis and the biotech industries through grass-fed ventures. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Can you tell me? Can we unpack that a little bit more? Many people that are listening, I'm sure, know who Field Trip is. I mean, it goes without saying, but maybe we can unpack that a little bit and talk about your experience in running the journey.
Sure. It's a very germane conversation because some people will be aware that Field Trip recently filed for creditor protection. So as much as we had a big dream to change the world, and I think we did in many ways, we weren't ultimately successful from a financial business perspective. But that's also been a deep learning for me. But I'll go back to the beginning, which was I grew up pretty straight edge. I was not interested in drugs. I didn't really care that much if my friends drank and did drugs, but it wasn't for me. It was too out of control from my perspective, and I didn't know why anyone would do the whole dare to do drugs. This is your brain on drugs kind of messaging. Right. Sure worked well for me. As I grew up and discovered the joys of alcohol in university, my perspective started to change. And actually, it was the author Tom Robbins who changed my perspective on drugs altogether when he was sharing his first experience with LSD back in the 60s. And he felt like it was just eye-opening, and he felt connected to everything. And it changed his entire worldview after that experience. And that was the first time actually I had ever realized that drugs, narcotics could be used productively. And so that opened my eyes and my mind to the possibilities around this. Happened to have an opportunity to get involved in the cannabis industry in Canada in the mid 2010s. Saw it just as a great opportunity, didn't pay much heed to, some of the deeper considerations around it. And in that experience, I saw just how potently effective cannabis could be as medicine. I'd always thought of it as just as a recreational drug or a drug of abuse, but then I saw it.
Pineapple Express. Yeah,
totally. Mango haze. I saw it as a really potent medicine. And during this time, I'd be working with Erwin, who I'd mentioned, on a sort of spiritual exploration. Started very therapeutic, but has certainly gone down a spiritual path. And after we left the cannabis industry, learned something was happening with psychedelics. And I vaguely recalled Peter Thiel having invested in some psilocybin company or something like that. But as I started to look into it, I realized that, in many ways, the zeitgeist around psychedelics had changed. There's something energetically different in the world around psychedelics. Most people just hadn't caught on to the fact of it. And I was like, we got to do something here. Not only do I think it's a great business opportunity, I think it's what the world needs. And I remember having this internal dialogue or monologue, depending on your perspective, with myself being like, I use the archetype of, a 28-year-old bro from somewhere in the Midwest. And I'm like, could I ever get that guy to go to therapy or have a spiritual conversation? The answer was, in most cases, probably not. Could I get that guy to try mushrooms? The answer was, more likely than not. And if I can get someone to try mushrooms, I can open them up to other conversations. And that probably is the most important thing we could be doing on the planet right now, as far as I was concerned. And so out of that, Field Trip was born. And the real purpose of it was to try to normalize access to psychedelics, because even to this day, even 4 years later, as much as we've done an incredible amount to bring the conversation to the dinner tables of Canada and the US and around the world, and we had been very successful in that, most people still think about psychedelics in 4 quadrants. It's for hippies. It's for Joe Rogan and the Silicon Valley bro types. It's for, military veterans who have experienced traumas that most of us can't even imagine. or it's for people who are suffering from truly intractable depression and other mental health disorders. And that's not 96%. That's like the 4%. What about the 96% in the middle? And my goal was to try and bring the conversation to the 96% in the middle, to be like, this is a conversation worth exploring, whether it's through drugs or breathwork or meditation or otherwise. These explorations need to be happening. Otherwise, the things that are making our society so dysfunctional in so many ways will never resolve. We've got to kind of step up our consciousness. And so at our peak, we had 12 clinics across Canada and the US providing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. We had one in the Netherlands providing psilocybin-assisted therapy, generating tremendous results, still based in a mental health conversation in terms of depression and anxiety, but opening people up to perspectives that they hadn't seen before. And I think that's the magic of psychedelics in this work, is you just see things differently in a way that really is ingrained into you, as opposed to just being a nice academic exercise. And so that's what happened. But unfortunately, we spent too much money trying to build it, and the capital markets turned south, and we weren't able to raise additional capital. And so that's why we entered restructuring last month.
Now, are you closing your doors, or how is that going to work? I mean, you're in the restructuring phase, so you still have centers and you're still involved with that, but there's an idea of retooling, getting rebooting, resetting, reframing the conversation and the narrative. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So I'm not going to be personally involved in a sort of post-restructuring world, but we're talking to a number of different parties and partners who will take the clinics and our protocols and our clinical team and build them under a new umbrella, maybe the Field Trip name, but with a kind of different operating thesis. So Field Trip will live on in some form or another after the restructuring, but it will look fairly different from what it was.
Yeah. I mean, certainly in terms of the vision and in terms of the plan, I if nothing else, I think you're probably, years ahead of the market, and the market has just, didn't change quickly enough to go ahead and catch up. I think that's, if nothing else, because essentially what you're doing from a boutique viewpoint, from the ability to go into a space that really allows an individual to not only feel safe, but to go ahead and have the necessary ancillary services, the health and wellness, the integrated health and wellness services that will really help them be empowered, right? I mean, those things are really essential, and you don't see them, unfortunately, you do not see them in the mental health community.
Yep.
It's not an integrative health and wellness community. For some reason, the care has come out of health care.
Yeah.
And I don't get it. And it's money. It's pure money. And that's the issue.
It's money. There's a lot of reasons for it. A lot of people are like, oh, big pharma is evil. I've worked with a lot of people in big pharma, and I think they're all extremely well-intentioned people. I think it's a combination of factors, which is you can't look at the success of the pharma industry and the move towards what people call sick care now, as opposed to healthcare, without looking at the litigation environment in Canada and the US, which is doctors have no incentives to go out on a limb because they just get sued left, right, and center. And so they have an incentive to follow what's been approved, what's safe, what's simple, and not be unconventional. It's just not worth it. They're trying to make a living as well. So there's a number of reasons that's happened. But yeah, we've taken two things. One, we've moved to a sick care model because I think in some ways it's simpler. But also, we've taken, people talk about the separation of integrative medicine is about mind, body, and spirit. We've separated those, and our healthcare system is just based on the body now.
Right. Just on the actual, we're treating the symptoms. We're not really treating the individual and or their bios. We're really treating what the disease is, or what the virus is, right? We're not treating the bios.
Yeah, we're treating the biochemical mechanisms of it, but we're not looking at the underlying causes and drivers of it. And that's definitely more complex. So I understand.
Let me ask you a question, Ronan. You have the idea of accelerated treatment. Is that the whole idea of accelerated treatment is appealing, through the through the field trip model, the integration of it all. But, I'm just wondering, how might that work? How might all of this work in a larger landscape? Is it, from your view, given your field trip background and your experience and really coming early to the market, where do you see the roadblocks in terms of service? I know you broke it into 4 particular quadrants. I'm certainly in a couple of those quadrants as a vet, but also as someone who's experienced early childhood trauma. But, where do you see this happening? Because, we're going out to the convention. Hopefully there will be 10,000 people there. I know we're at the Denver Convention Center. It's going to be big. Is this the beginning of the change that we wish to see?
I think so. I think the world is kind of waking up. I think there's been a number of drivers that have forced people to question a lot of assumptions about how our society works. If you look at it on a kind of spiritual level, it's kind of the creative destruction phase where like the old has to fall away before the new can kind of come into the world. And you can see that happening on a lot of levels. Mm-hmm. But I do think this convention will be a driver. I think there's going to be a number of drivers, right? They're all just small catalysts. You're really trying to turn a ship around, a very massive entrenched ship around. And it's not going to happen in a single step. And so, when the New York Times had psychedelics on the front cover a year and a half ago, talking about how psychedelics are revolutionizing psychiatry, like to me, that was the starting line. That was the trigger being pulled on the start of the race. I think this conference is going to be a good step. I think the approval of MDMA assisted therapy, which should happen, as MAPS is leading by the end of this year, early next year. Oregon and Colorado, both legalizing access to psychedelics. These are all things. They're all, little baby steps towards a big shift. But what we thought about with Field Trip and what I stand by to this day, even though we really received a lot of scrutiny, is it's going to take a long time for people to really drop into a spiritual ceremonial situation and be comfortable. Most people just aren't there right now. And so creating a framework that, if people are comfortable in this box over here, where you have one toe into that box and then one toe into a different box, and hopefully they'll evolve that way. That's what we were trying to do. So we set it up in a way that was very clinical, very approachable. Our design and our aesthetic was not too conservative. It was designed to be friendly and more lifestyle oriented, but it was doctors, it was therapists, it was clinical because people are comfortable with that. They like having a doctor there. I'm personally of the viewpoint, I'm like, I don't know why you would want to, I don't have a rabbi present during my surgery. So I don't know why I'd have a doctor present during a psychedelic experience. It's kind of a similar framework. It's not an entirely perfect analogy. But for a lot of people that gives comfort. And so it's like, okay, let's meet them where they are. And that was a stepping stone. And so I think this conference will help. And I think just everyday conversations like this, every person who's like, I'd never consider it before, but I'd give it a try now. It's like, it's going to be a journey that's achieved one person at a time. And that's okay. But I don't think there's any single moment where there's this massive revolution that happens. I think it's just day by day keeping at it.
So let me ask you in that perspective, because we're talking about the potential future. Actually, we're talking about the present, how things are at the moment. But you've been involved in the psychedelic and cannabis space for over a decade. And I'm just wondering, maybe the attitudes, the perceptions, how do you see them shifting?
They're shifting quite a bit. One of the things I think I'm most proud of what we achieved at Field Trip is that Field Trip had 40% of share of voice in the entire industry. You can read about Field Trip in just about every major publication worldwide these days, with the exception of a few. And that's just emblematic of the shift. And it's one of those things, you hear in marketing speak that a person has to have 7 touch points with a brand before it becomes memorable or before they have a positive experience with it. And it's the same thing, I think, with psychedelics, which is the more this conversation happens, the more you hear about the good stories, the more you hear about the science, the more it's going to shift it. And that's just what we got to keep at. And, I think it will eventually get there. And I think attitudes are shifting. We get people coming into the clinics who were at one point being like, I would never touch that stuff. No way. And then they're in there in the chair having some of the most transcendent experiences of their life. So, the world always surprises.
Mm-hmm. So, you've had all these experiences, you have this perspective, the hindsight, you've had some insight. You are right now involved with this Non-Ordinary Company, and you've got this film. I went to the website, I put my name in, I'm on the list. I'm just wondering, like, okay, what's that about? What's I know we started to talk a little bit about it, but maybe you can give some more insight, because I love what you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah. The insight is that with Field Trip, we tried to build the brick and mortars, four-wall centers to provide access and change attitudes towards this. But content and communication and media is inherently more scalable, and it's more digestible. And even if you're fundamentally opposed to psychedelics, it's not a huge ask to give us half hour, an hour of your time to watch an entertaining, vulnerable, touching, documentary. And that's kind of it. So one of the things I've realized is that all paths forward to greater access are worthwhile. And so if that means clinical, great. But if it's limited to clinical, then I think that's a disservice to all of humanity. And so just keeping the conversation out there, getting more people to see other faces involved in the space or benefiting them. To me, that's how we move the needle. Right. As I touched on earlier, what psychedelics, there are many mechanisms of action, but if I was going to identify the single most potent one from my perspective of what psychedelics do, is they make you see the stories you're telling yourself. And if you see the stories you're telling yourself, you can then change the stories. You can change those narratives. And if we're talking about narratives, then media is fundamentally how you shift narratives, right? So it was just a more natural nexus to helping people change the stories they tell about themselves, and they tell about the world, and they tell about psychedelics, and so that's the effort with the Non-Ordinary Company. So the documentary is called "Everybody is Doing Drugs," and it's all about the people, places, and compounds that are part of this psychedelic renaissance.
And it's everybody'sdoingdrugs.com, right?
That's correct. And we've got amazing cameos. Rick from MAPS is in it. We've got Dr. Carl Hart. We've got Jamie. We've got wonderful people who are involved with the documentary. But Michael Pollan, who's known by anybody.
I was just going to go there. I mean, it's only been a year since his Netflix series came out. So
And it was how to change your mind. And the way we think about everybody is doing drugs is how do you change your heart, right? Which is how do you get past the logic being like, oh yeah, the data is really interesting, to being like, oh, that's a really powerful story that touched me deeply. Because it's going to be the stories that touch you deeply that lead to change behavior, as opposed to being like, oh, that's really interesting actually. And so that's how we think about it. And
Beautiful. That's great. So I know we're coming towards our time, but I do have one question that I have to ask you, and it's not going to be that sort of end question that everyone kind of wonders, oh, like, why didn't he ask that at the beginning? But there might be some element to that. Okay. So your view on the sort of the divide, I'll call it the divide between the entheogens and the psychedelic biotech, bioscience kind of movement, because I do want to get your perspective on it. Whereas there's kind of a split or a chasm, but there doesn't need to be a chasm. I think Field Trip did a lovely job of trying to bring the two of those together. But maybe you can speak to that. And specifically, I think there are some growth areas in this area in both camps, as we start to take a look at, well, I don't want to feed you your lines, but there's stuff around spirituality, changes of churches, 508c1As, the whole nine yards. And we've had a lot of people talk about that recently, but I'd like to get your view about where you think we're going. And is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or is it both and?
I think it's both and. The fundamental thesis I have is, this can be construed the wrong way, but it's like, mind your damn business, right? Which is like, if someone's doing it the biotech way and that speaks to people, cool, that's awesome. Be happy that people are being served by that process.
Mm-hmm.
And if someone likes the ceremonial way,
Mm-hmm.
cool, that's awesome. Let them have their way. All of them are right. All of them are perfectly correct for wherever people are. So instead of having judgments,
so the term would be stay in your lane. Yeah,
stay in your lane. I'd say mind your business. One of those things. But it's like, that can be construed in a negative way, which is like, don't be apathetic. It's like, just have compassion, being like, your way does not serve that person and that person's way does not serve you. And that's kind of cool. I was going to use an example being like, how do you brush your teeth? Do you use electric toothbrush? Do you do little circles? Do you swipe? We all have our own damn way of brushing our teeth and we're not judging each other for that. So why would this be any different than that? But for some reason, people have this strong opinion about how it should be done. And it's one of the things I've actually always struggled with about the whole psychedelic movement, which is, if psychedelics create enchantment and connection, why are there so many people so angry about how other people are doing it, right? It's one of those things where it's an incoherence that I haven't solved. But so going back to your question, it's like, I think both are great. And as long as we keep space for both of them, then that's the best outcome we could possibly ask for. Because, there are some people who will never go to Peru or Costa Rica for a very ceremonial experience, but want the newest, fanciest drug administered by a doctor. Wonderful. Right. That's totally cool with me. And and I just want to I would like it for everybody to have space for that. And I get there's some concerns that if it becomes too corporatized, then it's going to force out different, approaches. But my usual response to this, and what I generally believe, is that the whole pharma industry and the war on drugs was not successful in stamping out, what has become a very robust psychedelic movement. It was much more underground and less spoken to, but it still exists. It still burnt bright, just in different corners. Why do we think, the future is going to be any different? I don't think it will be. I think there's going to be lots of space for it, especially in a hyper-connected world with the internet and divergent viewpoints and all that kind of stuff. I think there's lots of space for everything here.
And the beautiful thing is, a lot of the biotechs are funding all the research. Yep. So you've got 500 institutions that are conducting research today. You've got 80,000 papers that have been out. So there's money involved with that. There's people that have to do that work, right? So, and it's not, you can't do that underground. You've got to do it above ground. So I think there is a tent that's big enough, and that tent is going to be the Psychedelic Science 2023 convention in Denver in June. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to seeing you there. But in the meantime, how do people get a hold of you, and how do they find out more about your work, your current work, and what you're up to, and where you're going to go ahead and take the industry next?
I really like how you circled that one up from beginning to end. That really brought it all together. So kudos to you in that line. How do people follow me? So on socials, it's Ronan D as in David Levy. So Ronan D Levy on Twitter and Instagram and all that kind of stuff. Everybody is doing drugs. everybodyisdoingdrugs.com is the website, and on socials it's Everybody Is Doing Drugs on Instagram. I think Everybody Drugs on Twitter. Those are two places to find out what's going on. If you want to follow the podcast, it's currently called the Non-Ordinary Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that kind of stuff. I'm thinking about changing the name to How We Evolve, because as we touched on earlier, that's really where my interest is, and I think a lot of people are deep into that exploration. And yeah, would love if you tuned in and appreciate this conversation. And if you're interested in any of the books, The Ketamine Breakthrough is the one that Dr. Mike Dow and I published recently through Hay House. And certainly check out the Psychedelic Summit through Hay House, because they've got, we were fortunate to interview some true giants in the space who shared a lot of wisdom and insight.
Mr. Ronan Levy, you're brilliant. You're really a bright light, and I really appreciate you coming on to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you for listening to the Mindfulness Experience podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. We have other exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. For more mindfulness tips and tricks, visit our website at workmindfulness.com. Thanks again for being a part of the Mindfulness Experience. This is Keith Fiveson.